Several years ago, the author and researcher Brené Brown gave one of her foundational TED Talks in which she shares the story of her research on the difference between people who go through life with a strong sense of love, belonging, and worthiness, the people that she deems the wholehearted, and those who don't. Over years of research, she discovered something surprising, almost paradoxical. The wholehearted were not people who had lived perfect lives, without stress or trauma, without fear or disappointment. They did experience those challenging sides of life, because we all do. The difference between the wholehearted and everyone else is that instead of trying to numb their vulnerability, they fully embraced it. They embraced those moments of life that left them feeling exposed and fragile. That's not to say they were comfortable with those moments or happy about them, but rather they viewed vulnerability as something that cultivated growth and was an intrinsic part of their life story. And this very fact enabled them to be wholehearted, to live with a sense of worthiness, gratitude, appreciation, and belonging. Although Brené Brown's research is seen as groundbreaking, the essential message of her talk, this message of the importance of embracing vulnerability, is not new. In fact, one could argue that it is the central message of Sukkot and the book of Kohelet. On Sukkot, we leave our firm and stable homes to enter into temporary dwellings, open to the elements. We literally expose ourselves and make ourselves vulnerable to the world. And in doing so, we perhaps paradoxically are meant to feel the most intense joy on this of any other holiday. Sukkot is also the holiday when we are commanded to feel sameach, utterly joyful. And Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, the Megillah for Sukkot, which we are about to read in just a few moments, also carries with it a key theme of vulnerability and fragility. One of the most famous verses is in the opening of the book when Kohelet declares, Havel Havalim, Amar Kohelet, Havel Havalim Hakol Havel. Our book translates as, utter futility, said Kohelet, utter futility, all is futile. However, Hevel does not only mean futility. In fact, it more often means breath. This is reflected in Robert Alter's translation. He reads this verse as, merest breath, said Kohelet, all is mere breath. Perhaps that is to say, everything is as fragile as a breath. We know it's here, but we cannot hold on to it. We cannot contain it. 1 minute an inhale, the next an exhale. And when we zoom out in the grand expanse of the universe, we find, as Psalm 144 states, Adam lahevel damam, yamav ketzel over. A human being is simply like a breath whose days are like a passing shadow. Kohelet often has a reputation for being depressing or fatalistic, but our rabbis would not have included his words in our canon if hidden in them were not also precious lessons of how to live life despite its fragility. Perhaps like Brené Brown, Kohelet recognized that the way to being wholehearted was to embrace our vulnerability. He may have focused a little more on the negative than we would have liked, but we know all too well that we are vulnerable. Our time on earth is fragile and fleeting. We, like Kohelet, do want to learn the best and most meaningful way to lead our lives despite all this. And so in the words of this scroll, He left a trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow, clues for how to lead a fulfilling life despite its fragility. So this morning we will explore 4 passages from Kohelet, which I believe contain 4 lessons for how to navigate life when confronted with our vulnerability. We will first explore chapter 1, verses 1 to 9. Lesson 1, we've been here before, which means we can survive this again. How many times have we heard the word unprecedented in the last 18 months? We live in unprecedented times. These are unprecedented situations. This word can make us feel lonely or frightened. But Kohelet comes with a different wisdom. Ein chadash tachat hashamesh, he says. There is nothing new under the sun. There is precedent for what we are going through. We may not be the innovators we aspire to be, but that also means we are not unique or alone in our trials and our suffering. Our ancestors have been here before. Our people have been here before. We know this is not the first pandemic, the first time our people have suffered. And we also know that they have survived. We can take strength and courage from their survival. We can glean wisdom from the lessons they learned, and in the very fact that this is not new, that this is not unprecedented, we can find reason for hope. We'll hear these verses chanted on page 57 of our Megillot books, the book of Kohelet, chapter 1, verses 1 to 9.
Divrei Kohelet ben David melech Birushalayim Havel havalim amar Kohelet Havel havalim akol havel Maitron ladam bechol amalo sheyamol tachat hashamesh dor holech ודור בא, והארץ לעולם עומדת. וזרח השמש ובא השמש, ואל מקומו שואף זורח הוא שם. הולך אל דרום וסובב אל צפון, סובב, סובב, הולך הרוח ועל סביבותיו שב הרוח. כל הנהלים הולכים אל הים, והים איננו מלא אל מקום שהנחלים הולכים שם, הם שבים ללכת. כל הדברים יגעים, לא יוכל איש לדבר. לא תישא בעין לראות, ולא תמלא אוזן לשמוע. מה שהיה הוא שיהיה, ומה שנעשה הוא שיעשה, ואין כל חדש תחת השמש.
We turn now to chapter 3, verses 1 to 13, which you'll be able to find on page 61. And we turn to lesson 2. To everything there is a season. Whenever I come to this passage, in addition to being reminded of the famous folk song, I am also reminded of a story. A story often told about King Solomon, who set a challenge to his people, asking for someone to find an object, one single object that would make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. Thinking he had set an impossible task, he offered infinite reward to the person who found this object, and everyone set to the task of trying to find something that would make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. Months and years went by. No one was able to find the right thing until one day someone came forward with a ring inscribed with 3 Hebrew words. Gam ze ya'avor. This too shall pass. 3 words that will make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. There's a time for everything. This is essentially the lesson Kohelet offers us here, that this too shall pass. All things come, and all things are exchanged for other things. This does sometimes temper our happiness, but when we are sad, we can remind ourselves there is a time for trouble, trials, and tribulations, but this too shall pass and give way to happier moments. And hopefully it also teaches us to appreciate the happier moments when they are with us, because we know they are precious and they may not always stay. We read on page 61, chapter 3, verses 1 to 13.
לכל זמן ולכל חפץ תחת השמיים, עת ללדת ועת למות, עת לטעת ועת לקוד נטוע, עת להרוג ועת לרפוא, עת לפרוץ ועת לבנות, עת לבכות ועת לשחוק, עת ספוד ועת רקוד, עת להשליך אבנים ועת כנוס אבנים, עת לחבוק ועת לרחוק מחבק, עת לבקש ועת לעבד, עת לשמור ועת להשליך, עת לקרוע ועת לתפור, עת לחשות ועת לדבר, עת לאהוב ועת לשנוא, עת מלחמה ועת שלום. מה יתרון העושה באשר הוא עמל? ראיתי את העניין אשר נתן אלוהים לבני האדם לענות בו. את הכל עשה יפה יפה ואיתו גם את העולם נתן בליבם מבלי אשר לא ימצא אדם את המעשה אשר עשה אלוהים מראש ועד סוף. ידעתי כי אין טוב בם, כי אם לשמוח ולעשות טוב בחייו, וגם כל אדם שיאכל ושתה וראה טוב בכל עמלו, מתת אלוהים
We turn now to page 72 to chapter 9, verses 7 to 10 for lesson 3, Savor the Moment. Here, Kohelet enjoins us to eat our bread in gladness, drink our wine with a lev tov, to drink our wine in joy. And in verse 10 tells us, whatever it is in our power to do, do with all our might. Things may be fleeting, we may not have much, but what we do have, we should enjoy, we should rejoice in, and whatever we are capable of doing, we should do. This reminds me of a powerful teaching that I read in the memoir Phosphorescence by journalist Julia Baird, something that she found in the research of psychologists, research that she called so simple and so basic that we do have to be reminded of it. Something that researchers call savoring. Our lives are surrounded by simple gifts that we take for granted and so often don't even pay attention to. That the key to happiness for many of us is not in finding more things to enjoy, but in finding the ability to enjoy and to savor what already is with us. Whether it's the sound of birds chirping at dawn, whether it's the sights we see on the walk between our house and our car every morning on the way to work, whether it's the simple gifts of a smile from a friend or even a stranger passing on our way. When we savor what we have, we find joy and the ability to draw from an inner strength and an inner peace to be able to do more in the world. We read on page 72, chapter 9, verses 7 to 10.
לך אכול בשמחה לחמך ושתה בלב טוב ינך כי כבר רצה אלוהים את מעשיך בכל עת יהיו בגדיך לבנים בשמן על ראשך אל יחסר את חיים עם אישה אשר אהבת כל ימי חייב לך אשר נתן לך תחת השמש כל ימי חבלך כי הוא חלקך בחיים ובעמל לך אשר אתה עמל תחת השמש כל אשר תמצא ידך לעשות בכוחך עשה כי אין מעשה וחשבון ודעת וחוכמה בשאול אשר אתה הולך שמה.
We turn to the concluding verses of the book now, page 77, chapter 12, verses 9 to 14, for the final lesson. When you feel the fragility and temporariness of life most acutely, anchor yourself in that which is stable. After an entire book primarily focused on life being fleeting and its pursuits being trivial, the tone of Kohelet suddenly shifts in verse 13, when Kohelet says, "The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe God's commandments." While at first glance this might seem out of place, in many ways it makes sense as a conclusion. Because if our lives are fragile and temporary, then the best way to combat that is to anchor ourselves to that which is stable and enduring, to anchor ourselves to God or tradition, a shared system of values and a shared collective story. As individuals, we may be vulnerable, but as people with a shared sense of purpose, there is nothing fleeting about us. And so, in his final words of wisdom, Kohelet teaches that when confronted with our vulnerability, we can cultivate resilience and even joy by connecting to that which is greater than us. We read on page 77, chapter 12, verses 9 to 14.
ויותר שהיה קהלת חכם, עוד לימד דעת את העם, ואיזן וחיקר, תיקן משלים הרבה. ביקש קהלת למצוא דברי חפץ וכתוב יושר דברי אמת, דברי חכמים כדרבונות וכמסמרות נטועים בעלי אסופות ניתנו מרועה אחד, ויותר מהמה בניזהר עשות ספרים הרבה אין קץ, ולהג הרבה גיית בשר. סוף דבר הכל נשמע, את אלוהים ירא, ואת מצוותיו שמור, כי זה כל אדם. כי את כל מעשה האלוהים יביא ומשפט על כל נעלם, אם טוב ואם רע. סוף דבר הכל נשמע, את האלוהים ירא, ואת מצוותיו שמור, כי זה